Welcome to Festival Hall and the Reedville Fishermen's Museum Winter Spring Lecture Series. This is our second one of the series. Our speaker today is Bill Corbett. He's a retired spotter pilot from Omega Protein. He's been an avid aviator for a number of years, and he'll tell you all about it. But he has some great stories to tell about his experiences as a spotter pilot. I do want to announce that our next lecture, which is going to be held April the 4th, features Joanne Finkling. She is part of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and she's going to talk about what life was like for families during the Civil War, and specifically what was going on with the families in the Northern Neck. So we're hoping everybody, should be quite an interesting discussion. We're hoping everybody can come out for that too. But without further ado, I'm going to ask Bill Corbett to come up and regale us with his experiences as spotter pilot. Thank you. We are going to have a book signing right after. Bill wrote this book. It's being sold for $12. So afterwards, please join him and talk to him a little bit more about his stories and maybe purchase one of his books.
Thank you. Wow, this is a nice crowd here. Last time I did this, it was called Show and Tell. Second grade, got a D-. So anyway, so this is what Scannerland looks like. I've been talking to y'all for years. I just couldn't see you. Part of my training was summer '77. I got to crew in the boats, the Atlantic coast, Captain Norman George and Meredith Robbins on the Queen for a while. And I was amazed the first time I went uptown to invest in a new set of boots and oilskins. Everybody stopped me in the store and said, "You're on Norman George's boat?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, what in the world happened down in the bay? We heard y'all got net to wheel." And somebody else said, "And I heard you got gilled up so bad you had to run the net back. You had to tow the boats back to the factory." I couldn't believe these people knew more about what happened on the boat than I did, really, from listening to the scanners. So anyway, y'all might have heard me referred to as Gorbachev or Gorby or 37 or Spotter 7 or 04 Victor. And if you had a VHF scanner, you probably heard something spicier than that. But anyway, I'm from Poquoson, and I flew out of Newport News when I was based here on the bay. You can flip to the next picture. And this is my hometown. Poquoson's on the right. This is Back River, Hampton Fox Hill on the left. And this may be a forgotten little tidbit, a link between my hometown and Reedville. It was right in that area, just inshore that speedboat there, is 100 submerged pylons. You don't want to go in there. And that is the wharf from the original fish factory that was set up after the Civil War. The story I've always been told about it is the smell was so bad that the people from Fox Hill and Buckrow and Hampton asked them to leave. And so they picked up stakes and moved up the bay to Reedville. But that's Factory Point, and it's a very popular party place now. But you've got to be careful if you come in there. You got to come in from the west side or you'll get tore up at all those submerged pylons. And then you see in the background, that's runway 26 at Langley Field. And one one little piece of history. Of course, the menhaden line on all those rivers down there run from point to point. And I can only remember 2 sets while I was in the business that took place on that line. One of them was successful. The next day it was not successful. And what happened was I'd been out flying some friends around on Sunday, and I saw these whackers come out, and anyway, I called my chief and told him about them, but he said, well, Factory Point, we can't go in there. So the next day we were all squiddling down the bay, and I went up there and looked. I said, I think there's about a 300,000 bunch coming out of this back river, if you can get up in there. Captain Henry Dixon came up from Thimble and managed to get in there, and he did it just right. He stalled and waited for the flood tide to quit, and we set right on slack water just outside the line. And he was able to complete the set before ebb tide got off. They had a heck of a time turning. You can see the channel's real narrow. They had a hard time turning around, getting out of there. And but they pulled it off, pumped about 300. The next day, somebody came in there and tried to do the same thing, and the timing was off just a little bit, and ebb tide got them and drug them out on this bar here. And of course, the steamer went aground, couldn't get to them. It was a clear cluster, as I call it in my book here. But anyway, this is what we call Egg Island Bar down here, and this was actually charted islands when John Smith came through here, off of Pocosin, and had trees on them and all. They had this was Long Island and then Egg Island to the north. And I often think about that when they're trying to sell us on all this, this sea level rise and the carbon footprint and all that. I said, well, it looked like to me we've had a lot of problems with sea level rise for a long time, and unless those Indians were burning a lot more coal than I think they did, it wasn't anything to do with carbon footprint. Sea level's been coming up for hundreds of years around here because those islands were gone. If you look at Revolutionary maps, those islands were already submerged. But anyway, that's the hometown, and it's just kind of a forgotten link. We had another fish factory that I'd love to see a photograph on the north side of Pocosin. It was over just maybe a mile southwest of Two Marsh Light. And you fly over today, you can still see the footer for a good size boiler and the docks and all that in there. It was, we call it Back Creek. But I've never been able to find out much information about when it operated or even find a photograph of it. But anyway, recently I had somebody call me all excited. They wanted me to put them in contact with somebody up here that they wanted to take over, say they were going to save the company all millions of dollars by taking over with drones. There's no sense in having these expensive airplanes out there. We could do this job with drones a lot cheaper. And all I could think about was what I went through trying to get qualified to do this job, and what some poor captains went through when they were trying to, get me trained. And so go ahead and flip the thing. And so this is probably a good way to go through what was involved. When I ended up flying for Peck Humphreys in the 80s until we were bought out by Ampro, they sent a mid-level manager up to meet with all the spotters, and he promptly insulted us with, "You men make a lot of money for not having a college education." And somebody raised their hand and pointed out promptly that, pardon me, but there's no 4-year degrees in light shades and whipping fish, while you were out joining the fraternity, we were pulling corks and, and seeing what gillers were all about. So anyway, when this guy, it brought all that back when the guy started talking about the drones. And for me, it was a 4-year process. And what happened was in the fall of '76, I ran into Lim Johnston. See if you can pull over to a picture of him. It might be 2 or 3 down away. We'll root around. There he is, right there. Anyway, he was flying out of Gloucester Airport, and I was up there, and we had a conversation. I was in the spraying business, and he said, "You keep messing with those sprayers, you're going to end up in a pine box." And I said, "Well," I said, "you take off in the morning, same time I do. I'm back in 30 minutes drinking coffee. You're gone for 12 hours in the haze. I don't see how you stay awake out there." He said, "Son, if you think it's boring, you need to come on and go with me." And so I did, and the first ride I went with him was in September '76. Big showing of fish off of Cape Henry. Of course, I don't even know how many airplanes, but it was a lot. It was basically 3 companies down there. I know we were stacked up to 6,500 feet. Lim was at 55. And there was somebody in a tri-pacer over our head, 500 feet over our head at 6,000. And every time he'd set a boat, he'd come down, get in the middle of our windshield. Scared, And all this was going on before the sun come up. People racing for fish and screaming and shouting on about 4 different radios. Lim looked at me and said, "Well, son, you still think it's boring?" I said, "No, sir." So anyway, Lim explained to me that I had a limited opportunity, that he was one of the first generation fish spotters. He started in '52, the year I was born. And the fishing company came to the airport and recruited pilots that were already rated, knew how to fly. And the main thing they wanted was, you got to be able to get up in the morning. You got to be on time. We can't have you up drinking all night and dragging in at 8 o'clock. You've got to be over the boats when the sun comes up. And he told me his first week he flew around with his chief pilot, flew him around in an Apache, and he got to land at Crab Island. So he was working out of New Jersey somewhere up there. But he told me, he said, "You've got a unique opportunity that's probably going to get ready to close on you." He said, "Because what's happened is this first generation of spotters, the safety record was so dismal, and the captains were routinely pulling dead spotters out of the water from mid-air collisions, and they discouraged their sons from getting in the airplanes because the mid-air collision problem was so bad." And he said, "We've just about got a handle on that. We've slowed down, the safety's really improved, better radios, training, cooperation between the companies and all." He said, "So what's happening now is the captain's sons are starting to look at those airplanes, and boy, that looks like he's going to be home in about 20 minutes. I'm going to be, midnight for The airplanes are starting to look good to them. They're starting to come on. And within a few years, this window will be shut. It'll be a closed group that you probably won't be able to enter into." And he said, "I can't promise you anything, but if you come on and fly with me this fall," he said, "I used to be chief pilot, and he said, if I think you can hack it, and I recommend you, it carries some weight." So I did. I rode with him all that fall, and it was funny because somewhere in here I talked. Let's see if we can find a picture of the plantation house he lived in. It was called Glenroy. There it is, right there. And anyway, I've got a story about that in here. And one of the first morning, what he did, I lived in Pocosin, and he was flying out of Gloucester. And for a while, I was commuting back and forth 60 miles. And he said, "Hey, you can't be doing that. Just come on, and we got this big house. You can stay with us." And the first morning I rode to the airport with him, I was just completely terrified. He drove like Fireball Roberts. I mean, we slide through turns and, running stoplights, whatever. And he explained to me, he said, you can't be late. The competition's over the fleet 5 minutes and can ruin your whole day. So anyway, I thought about that when in my first season back here on the bay 4 years later, 1980. We had a big showing of fish over on the east side around Plantation, and it was a mad rush to get over there in the mornings early and get an altitude. And Charlie Pittman, chief pilot, called up. He said, things had slowed down late mid-morning. He says, well, we got to start breaking it up for fuel. Who needs to go in first? And I said, well, I guess I probably ought to go in because my car was on fire when we took off. So he said, what? I said, well, yeah. I said, I don't know what happened, but about 2 miles from the airport, it was a big bang and, flames and smoke. And I just figured if it would make it to the airport, I'd just, I'd just go get another car. But I maybe ought to go see what's left. And so anyway, I followed in Lim's footsteps. I'm just a pretty bad driver on the way to the airport in the mornings myself. But
That's your house?
no, that was Lim worked a deal. That house was abandoned. It's right down on the Ware River. And that when he found it, it was abandoned, and he worked a deal with the owner that he would restore the house if they would give him a reduced rent on it. And then when they sold it, he would get a percentage of the sale. It was a great deal. And but it was a beautiful, I think it was built 1850. It was right on the water, and 60 acres. And
What's that in the front?
that's a circle. Well, there's a pool over on the side. This is, of course, circular driveway, and then it had carriage houses and the long driveway going out the front. It was a beautiful home. And Lim was there with a bunch of women. So at the end of the fall season, he said, look, they've transferred me to Charleston. And he said, I've got a house full of women. I got to move all this furniture. He said, I'll pay you if you help me move to Charleston. So in December, I came up there, and we went and got a U-Haul truck, worked all day, loaded everything up, and then all day, all night, we got the truck loaded about midnight, and we got in the truck and headed for Charleston. 12 hours later, we rolled into Charleston. I was just about punch drunk. And then I couldn't believe it. We had to unload the whole truck again, even hang every picture. But so anyway, he helped get me a job at the local airport down there, and I had some interesting flying jobs out of Charleston for a while. But anyway, and then what happened was Lim told me, he said, probably really good if you followed up that time I spent with you, if you go back and get a job on the boat. So I did that. Came back up, and Captain Meredith Robbins took me on for a week just to let me see, what it was like. On that Friday, headed up to Bay, he came on the radio and said, hey, anybody need a man? He said, I got this boy from Pocosin, and he wanted to be a plane man, but he wants to spend the rest of the summer on the boat. Captain Norman George came on. He said, I need somebody. He said, I had a man injured today. So I ended up by luck, on the high boat. And it was great training because the crew loved it, because every time the spotter would do something stupid, they'd turn around and look at me and say, now, Mr. Plane Man, don't you do this to us when you get up there. And anyway, it was just a great experience. Norman George and Carter Hardin was his mate, and that man showed me what work ethic was all about. Never could figure out when he slept. He was up all the time. But the first week I was on there, it was a clear disaster. I mean, we got net in the wheel, getting boats up down the bay, and So that was awful. We had to come up, change nets, hire a diver, get the net out the wheel and all that. And then a couple days later, I think we had another disaster. We were coming down by a little bay, and spotter comes on and says, "Man, I got a mammy." He just come out of Hummel for breakfast. He says, "I got a mammy whacker right here in the wrap." I said, "I've been in the business 2 days. I know what that is." And Carter said, "What do you think it is?" I said, "That's Gillers." And he said, "You're probably right." And sure enough, we went in there. We got stuck up so bad we couldn't even get the boats up. We had to tow them back to Reedville, run the net out in the field. Anyway, it was such a string of disasters. By Friday, the crew was starting to look at me like, maybe we need to throw you overboard, Jonah. So anyway, thank God. All I could think about it, I said, if this is the high boat, what in the world's going on the low boat, But anyway, and you can go back to my mentor page, back up. There was a lot of people that I really owe a debt to. Red Henson, he probably saved my life in the purse boats a couple times there when we had some stuff going on and I was too green to know to get out of the way, But it was just a great education. And then at the end of that season, Lim put in a good word for me, and I got a job in '78 down in Fernandina. And so I ended up, I bought a super cruiser and headed south and put in a season. That was a good training situation down there. They only had one boat, no competition. And so all you really had to do was learn how to set the boat, and I was mortified the first week I came out. The first set I made, I ran the man right over the fish. And so he got net back and we shot her again. This time I opened up too soon. And I told him, I said, "Captain, I'm sorry, I am not going to shoot you again until I get somebody in here that helps me get straight." So I went inshore and I found this retired fish spotter named Rocky. I'm not going to attempt his last name. I'll probably get it wrong. But this man holds the world record for crashing airplanes. He had flown on the bay and he had crashed so many airplanes he couldn't get insurance anymore. And they sent him down to he got a job down in Fernandina, and he continued crashing airplanes down there. He had a little dog that flew with him for a while until the last crash. I think then the dog decided he didn't want to fly with him anymore either. I was so desperate, I went and got Rocky and drug him out to the airport, convinced him to get in that super cruiser with me. So anyway, he flew with me a few days to help me get straight, and we had a pretty good season down there. The next year, I got to move over to Mississippi, '79, and flew for Zapata over there. And then in '80, Peck Humphrey hired me to come back up on the bay. So anyway, it was a 4-year process for me to get trained, and then even after you could probably say I was another 5 years getting all the nuances down. But to realize how far the menhaden aviation has come, you got to look back to how bad it was and how bad it can be. The Alaska boys up there in the herring fishery, they had 5 mid-airs in one day. And they passed a law that they had to carry a safety observer with them all the time. And their job is not just to look for other airplanes. And but we've come a long way here on the bay with better radios, better communication. Just a better organization between the pilots, as far as we know now that when you're sharing altitude, you've got to have hard limits. GPS has been a big help, because even when you're out in the ocean and you can't see a good landmark, you can come on and say, "Hey, I'm not going above line so-and-so," And where the problem comes in is when you've got limited altitudes and you've got a bunch of airplanes you got to fit in there. You end up sharing altitude, so everybody's got to be on the ball. And all it takes is somebody to miss a call, and you can end up in the same circle with somebody. One of the other big improvements, see if you can flip around and find it. There's a picture of my red airplane in there that I headed south with. Right there, go back one. That was the standards fish spotting machine through the 50s and into the 60s. That's a three-seat Piper, 1947. I flew that in front of Dean. In fact, Mr. David down here took that picture. That was me leaving in 78, going loaded down with everything I could get in it, headed for Fernandina. And one of the problems with those airplanes is center line with a stick. You could circle in either direction. And, so you can see where a problem is. If you got one guy that out there prefers to circle to the right and everybody else circling to the left, if you do have a problem, it's a whole lot more sudden and severe. And but when the Cessnas came along, oh my gosh, they were like Cadillacs. These things here would fry you in the summertime and freeze you in the wintertime. Good flying airplanes. I loved mine. It was great for where I was. But on a long day, if I had to fly that on the bay, I would have probably fried. But anyway, the Cessnas were a big advantage. You got everybody turning to the left. That was a big safety improvement. And so anyway, that's one reason. When the guy said he wanted to revolutionize the whole industry with these drones, I could think about how hard it was for me to acquire the skill set that I needed. It's not just flying around looking down, oh, there's some fish. We had spotters that would go on a patrol and say, oh yeah, 50 million fish east of Cape Sandplas, send the fleet. Get there, and Monday morning you set on them and it's grass. We just ran 18 hours for nothing, So there's a lot more to it than just looking out the window. See if we can find the sequences. There we go. Here's right there. And this is what takes some time to learn. And it's kind of like hitting a baseball. Even after you learn it, you can get in a slump and have a bad time. Set of purse boats, he's running down on a steamer-sized bunch of fish up here. It's probably about 300,000 or 400,000. It's strung out a little bit going into the tide. That mud that you see there is tide mud. But you can see that the bunch of fish is stirring up its own mud trail. So flip to the next one. Okay, now here's the hard part. You've got to get the boats lined up, and you've got to judge when to let them go. And if you screw that up, there's not much. You can make minor corrections, cap boat wide, bring the little boat in, whatever. But in this set, I would say the man's a little bit close here. He's probably chewing his fingernails off going, oh my God, we got too close. And I think what saved it is a good chance this is Captain Alan Henson back at the islands. Because I saw later on, I think the tide lands in this picture. You go ahead into the next one. He's coming around. I think the water was shallow enough that getting too close didn't if that had been out in 60 foot of water, it'd probably been all over with. They'd have gone under the kept on going. But because we were in shallow water behind the islands, we held them. Going to the next one. And that's what you want to see. Is when they break up. That's about 300,000 or so, going crazy there. But it takes a while to get to that, and so the drone man, I think, he could, it's conceivable he could find a fish, but whether he could evaluate them and set you on them would be, probably couldn't do it. Let's see. Let's flip through some of the other pictures real quick. Oh, that's Joe Weinger when his airplane. I think that's the 29 pumping there, but you flip on through. I think that was, that's either 470, company spare, or it might have been Gerald Honeycutt had that paint job too for a while, but let's flip on through. This is Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and that features in a couple of stories in the book. The first story in there is Martha Jane to the Rescue, and that was a classic cluster that descended on me back there, and I came very close to ending up in those woods down there. In fact, I started to name that story The Woods at Ocean Springs because the night that I almost went down in those woods, all I could think about was I knew two planes that were flown by friends of mine had already gone down in those woods. So anyway, I knew there was alligators waiting for me, and I was very glad to get back around and get on the ground. I flew out of there in '79, and then 87, Peck Humphreys, we took a little vacation for a while there in 86, 87, and I ended up going to work at a Stennis, Mississippi, in 87 down there, and it's, and that's one problem I kind of messed up with the book. See if you can go back to the table of contents. There we go. Go back, first one. It dawned on me after I did that. The way I arranged these stories, these are all short stories. And of course, they're all nonfiction, But I arranged the airplane stories up front because I figured, these books would probably go to aviators and aviation nuts. And so I was afraid that if I put some of the more family-oriented stuff up front, they might lose interest in it. So that's the way I decided to do it. These are all mostly airplane things until Gettysburg, and that's more of a family thing. And it dawned on me if I'd have set the timeline better, I actually have pretty good memoir here. If you take the collection in its entirety, let's see, Ghost Hunters. That was about some childhood friends I had right on to high school. In fact, it was funny. Ghost Hunters, I end up with the last line in that is, I have not known Phil Everhart since 1969 when he left for Tech. But I miss him still. Not just him, but a friend like him. Anyway, I got to see him for the first time since '69 this summer at a class reunion, and it was pitiful. Neither one of us recognized each other. But I told him, I said, look, before you get away, I've got something in the car for you. And he said, you've been carrying something around in the car since '69? I said, no, but you're a featured character in this book I wrote. I want you to have a copy. So, anyway, so if I'd have put Ghost Hunters first, you would have seen, where I came from as a child, and then Memories of Gloucester Airport. I started hanging out at the airport when I was 14. And in fact, the man that signed me off when I was 16 to solo never flew with me. He, when I turned 16, he called me in there. He said, you've been hanging around here long enough by now. You ought to know how to fly by now. Let me see your logbook. So he signed me off to go. And flip back to that one with the airplane with the, let's see if we can find that. There it is, right there. Come right there. I was 16 years old. That's Gloucester's airport. And that's my buddy down there. He's laid down on the runway taking that picture with his shoes in the bottom of the frame. It's not as bad as it looks. There was enough room. If the engine had quit, I could have gone to the other side. But what was fun about this is right after I got signed off, the man that ran the airport was yeah, anyway, the FBO closed. There was nobody running the airport, so that this other student pilot and myself, we had this classic airplane, Piper Cub, and a classic airport, basically all to ourselves. There's nobody supervising us. So we would run up after work in summer of '69 with 5 gallons of gas, and we could fly to dark. And we did all kinds of crazy things. And that was one of them right there. So if I'd arranged these stories a little better, it would have told my story. But the timeline got off quite a bit. Let's flip around and look at some of the other pictures here a minute. This was one of the airplanes I flew when I was building time towards a commercial pilot's license. And let's flip to another one here. This story now, I tried to do a little better than there I was on a dark and stormy night. I tried to put in a backstory on some of these. This guy was a classic aviation character. He was a crop duster that was trained just for this big DC-3 airplane to spray mosquitoes. So he had a commercial, multi, and a DC-3 type rating, no instrument rating. And he was paying me $10 an hour to fly right seat for him. And I loved it. It was a great airplane. It was just a super job, bombing around Charleston down low, spraying mosquitoes. But the backstory was, a lot of us young pilots that were struggling to get started in aviation fell victims to what I call blue sky aviation, and that's the real backstory in this. Was after I flew most of the summer with him and had gotten to learn him in the airplane and with the job doing pretty good, some British kid that was over here to get his ratings walked up and said, "Hey, I'll fly right seat for free." Well, anyway, yeah, it really bothered me. But then, over the course of time, I realized that a lot of these kids were just like my peers here. It would fall victim to blue sky aviation, and that's where even the airlines are guilty of this. They would promise you the moon. Just say, "Hey, if you come fly with us, build your time, get your hours in, you'll eventually fly good airplanes, make plenty of money." And a lot of them paid the ultimate price. The boy that took my job here, the two of them ended up going in the woods and exploded. And so he was one of them that paid the ultimate price for trying to get his start in aviation. And that's why I was so appreciative of menhaden aviation when I came to it. I mean, this was, I'd been promised the moon on a lot of jobs, but I realized this was the real deal. And this was my place in the sun if I could just, get in there and hang tough with it. And when I showed up in Reedville in 1977 to get on the boats, I was just about as broke as they come, So the industry was really good to me. And let's see if we can flip through this. There's Lim again. And one of the stories in there you all might like is called Night Off Myrtle Beach, and it involves 3 of these Atlantic-class steamers. These were some good shed freighters, 185-foot. Most of them, I guess they averaged about 1.5 million on capacity. But I was based in 81, 82. I flew out of Southport, North Carolina for Peck Humphreys, and we had 3 boats running down in May of 81 that got tangled up in some crazy business off Myrtle Beach. And anyway, I wrote the story on that. Some of the people in this audience were probably there that night when all that happened. But let's see, let's flip through and see if there's any other pictures I missed here. This photograph's not very remarkable, except this was the last day that both fleets fished together. In other words, Standard had sold to Ampro, and I think Ampro ended up throwing in the towel. I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly what year it was. I think it was early to mid-90s. And but this was down around Plantation, Cape Charles, and you can see, I think there's an Atlantic class steamer hooked on over there, but most of these are Zapata boats, but they're, this was the last day that we fished together. It was kind of the end of an era. Let's see if there's any more pictures of them. This was fall of the year, out in the ocean, migration. I think I was way up high, like 4,500 feet, and that was somebody down low setting the boat. There's actually 3 nets there. There's one boiling mud up there ahead of the airplane, and then, of course, this man's got his nets blowing up right there, and then open it up on it. It's not the greatest photograph. You can't really see the color on it, but it was kind of unusual that I was able to get, another airplane in, and it kind of demonstrates the difference in altitudes that we work. Sometimes in the ocean we'd be stacked up 6,000, 7,000. Well, 6,500 is the highest I ever tried to work a boat. But let's see if there's any more we missed in here. Oh, here we go. This is some more Carolina fishing. We call them Carolina bodies. Just if you look just offshore, that black mass, just offshore of that pump slip there. The foam coming off the back end of that one is actually, I'm pretty sure that's smothered fish. That, in other words, this is in the ocean now. There's such a huge biomass there that it's sucked all the oxygen out of the water in that patch of ocean. And those fish are dying from lack of oxygen. And because there's just so many of them in a tight area. Let's see what else we got here. Let's see if there's any. This photograph, that was the airplane I flew from 1980 till around 89, Tango Kilo. That picture was taken by Corbett, the Rittenhouse. What had happened was we had been run out of the restricted area, so for the net jets from the Tuxet to come down and bomb. So we're waiting on the restricted area to open up, and we're basically just on hold there. Harold Rittenhouse, Corbett, took that picture. That was a good airplane for me, man. Let's see if there's another one. This is the airplane that I replaced that one with. I got rid of the first one because I thought it was high time. It had 12,000 hours on it. I sold it to a buddy of mine, Will Sokol in Mississippi, and he kept flying it for another 5-6 years. And so anyway, I bought this one in about 89 had 2,000 hours on it. And anyway, I had the airplane fitted out just like I wanted it, and I kept it too long. I should have gotten something, but it was just so comfortable and so economical to operate. And it was like sitting in your easy chair at home, after a while. But when we retired this airplane, it had 28,200, which is very close to probably a North American record. So I put 26.2 on it. That's tachometer hours, which runs a little bit slow, I think. Usually multiplied by 1.2 on the tack. But shortly out, this was one of the last flights in this airplane. Let's see if we can find another. There we go. And I worried about selling it to somebody. We really don't know how long these airplanes will last. We're I used to tell everybody I'm into the flight test mode. I'm doing research in airframe longevity. But I had a chance to get the airplane in the test program over at NASA. And this was their lunar landing gantry, where they practiced landing on the moon. And it's about 300 foot tall. And back in August last year, this paint job, there's a bunch of little dots they put on there so they could record it. And the reason for this test was they were losing people up in Alaska where they would survive a crash in the boonies somewhere and die of exposure before they could find them. And all of these airplanes are required to have an emergency beacon on them. And what was happening is they'd find the people, they'd go up there and find the people dead from exposure, and there's the beacon laying in the snow blinking. In other words, the radio would survive the crash. It was working, but it had come loose from its mounting and no longer had an antenna, so they couldn't pick up the beacon and find the people in a timely manner. So the idea behind this program was they had this 04 Victor loaded up with emergency locator beacons so that they could try to find a bracket that would withstand the crash and keep the thing intact so that it would work like it was supposed to. Of course, it never did us any good because if you go in the water, then, you know, it's not going to work but about 2 seconds before it goes to the bottom. So anyway, but it was a big relief to me that I didn't have to worry about this airplane hurting somebody because I felt safe flying it, but we really didn't know exactly how far you can go with these things. It's metal fatigue and all that, but I wouldn't have had any problems flying it to California, you know. I still felt good in it. Let's see, I think my son found this picture for me. He said, Dad, you need to tell them about the first fish spotter out there, you know. And one bit of history I got a lot of mileage out of was, y'all aware of 1919, the U.S. Navy loaned a flying boat to the industry to fly some of the captains around and drop notes, you know, good fish, Tangier Sound driver, you know. Occasionally we'd be working down the bay and some airline guy would come through on Norfolk Approach or executive jet driver, and then they would be calling us out traffic, and the pilot would say, fish spotters, fish spotters. That hardly sounds fair. They're using airplanes to corral the fish. You know, like he acted like it was something new. I said, buddy, I don't know where you've been, but we've been flying around out here since 1919. And so, of course, there was a long gap in there. It really didn't come into its own. Lim told me that it really didn't come into its own until after World War II, Super Cubs, and they got radios that would fit, the whole radio would take up the whole back seat in the Super Cub. In fact, for a while, we got to see some of these airplanes were still in service up in Cape May as banner tow airplanes. They used to be fish spotters, but they still had these huge loudspeakers mounted on the side of them. And Lim said those things were the most fun because you could fly over and talk to anybody on the ground with them. Didn't have to have a radio. You could just look down behind the sand dune and say, I see you down there, you know, I'm going to tell your mama, you know, and stuff like that. That was a lot of fun. But he said that's when it came into its own, when the Super Cubs came out. But we owe a big debt to some of that first generation guys. They paid a heavy price, you know, getting us to where we are now as far as, you know, we've got a pretty good safety record. But it came by the hard way. All right, well, I sure appreciate y'all coming out.
Is Lem Johnson still around? Is Lem Johnson still around?
I went to his funeral in November. This just a couple months ago. He retired down behind Conway, by Florida Beach to Conway, South Carolina. And when his wife passed away, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, one of his daughters came and got him and took him down to Dayton, Texas. And it really bothered me because I spoke with him on the phone and sometime in early October, and the plan was I was going to go down there and visit him in November, and I think he died right around the end of October. But he did get to see the book. He was really excited about it. But he was an interesting guy. When he first landed the job, fish spotting, he realized that it was all about the voice. That these people that work with him were never going to see him. All they knew is a voice coming over the loudspeaker. And so on his first off season, when they cut out, he signed up for an elocution class. And we called him Golden Throat because he sounded just like the best disc jockey there ever was, Wolfman Jack or whatever. I mean, and everybody thought Lamb was this great big guy because of the sound of his voice, you know. And we'd go down to the boats in the fall of the year, and they'd say, "You're Lim Johnston? I thought you'd be 6 inches between the eyeballs," you know. But he looked a lot like Gene Wilder, and he was about twice as funny. This guy was just a super clown. I'd tell you how crazy he was. He was flying out of Charleston. He was coming home from Southport on a Friday. He was flying down the beach. It was low tide. He looks down there, and there's a dead alligator washed up in the surf on the beach. Well, it's a desolate beach. So he whips around and lands. He said, "Oh, this is going to be great." Throw the dead alligator in the back of the airplane, go in there, scare the line boys to death. He said he wasn't dead. And he almost beat me back to the airplane. But, yeah, so he...
Just a second.
What's your name, sir? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
When you flew up on the Jersey coast with him or down here?
On the bay.
All right.
Yeah, I started in 1954, and I retired in 70.
Wow.
I'm the oldest fish spotter here, I think. I may be the oldest one here.
Yeah. Well, you look better than I do, so I don't know. How about Russ Bender? I guess you flew with Russ.
Yeah, Wes Jones, good friend.
He was the first spotter that I was exposed to as a young pilot around Newport News. You know, Russ was a legend. I mean, he really impressed us with.
He and I were good friends. He come up in 56 or 57 and started.
Wow.
But,
so what did you fly?
What?
What kind of airplane?
PA-12s, Super Cruisers,
All right.
Skylanes,
Wow.
Skyhawk, not Skyline.
Well, maybe you can help us out here. I tried to do a little research. I talked to Punky Curie and Don Sellers, tried to find out just how many mid-airs they had up here. I knew about a couple of them.
Yeah.
And he wasn't sure himself. He said he was going to try and check his records and get back to me, but I never did hear from him. Do you have any idea how many mid-airs did they have here in the 50s?
I can't hear you.
How many mid-airs do you think took place on the bay in the 50s?
What did you say?
How many mid-airs?
How mid-air collisions?
Oh, how many mid-airs? About.
Yeah.
You thought you were dead about 6 times a season.
Well, Lim told me that some of the men that he knew that got killed, it was their second collision. And in fact, it got to Lim bad enough that he got out of the business for a while, and Captain Lynn Lowry came and got him. He started selling insurance, and Captain Lynn came and persuaded him to come back to work.
Yeah, he was known as little brother. He landed the airplane, crashed out in the bay, and crawled out on top of the wing.
That's Lynn?
Yeah, Lim. And George Edwards dropped him a life raft that skipped across the water and landed on the wing. And 10 minutes he was back on the radio talking. Lim was a real character.
Yeah.
A nice fellow I've met too.
Wow. Yeah. Man, well, I'd love to hear about some of the experiences you had there. Can you remember some other names involved that you flew with back then? How about Benny? Did Benny Daughtry start? I guess he started in the 60s. Benny Daughtry?
Well, it was George Edwards.
George Edwards.
A lot of people know him here, and gosh, I can't think.
How about the guy I talked about that had the world's record for crashing airplanes? You remember him? Rocky, I think.
Rocky, yeah.
What was his last name? Coleman?
I don't remember his last name. I worked with him, but he kept crashing, and And I had five boats to myself most of the bay.
'Cause,
I had 5 boats and just me.
well, I heard about 2 major crashes he had down there at Hamp Roads, and then I think he flipped one over on the beach somewhere, and I think that's when they decided that was enough of him. But when he went to Fernandina, he flipped one over on the beach, and then the time the dog quit flying with him, he landed in a thunderstorm and flipped the airplane over. And they got him another airplane, but dog wouldn't fly anymore.
Because some people shouldn't be flying airplanes.
So, I was a desperate man to go get him and drag him out to the airport.
Yeah.
But I was so mortified after stabbing that man twice in a row, I said, I can't do this.
Yes, a lot of spotters in here wasn't even born when I started. When I got off the ship with Columbus, we started spotting fish. That's all I got to say. Somebody got a question.
Tell me your name again.
Edward Cockrell. No one knows it. Bill Cockrell. I live at Glee Point. I got an airport, Glee Point International, up by the bridge going to Wacomico.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's 1,200 feet long.
We got the rigs to come see you now. My friend David Groh, he's got a rocket champ, and I'm still flying light sport with a tailcraft. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of strips we like to go see now.
It's much different when I started. If we got up early, like you said, but if the engine started, the weather was okay. And we'd fly from about 5 o'clock until 7:30 at night. An average day was 12 hours.
I don't know how y'all did it in those.
I was younger.
I brought a little tape I made in '82 back here. I might try them on the way out. You might be able to flip by there. And there's a lot of voices that are long gone on there. But the main reason I wanted to bring that is one of the challenges of this job was we feed all these radios get fed into your one headset. And it would take me 2 weeks every year to get used to trying to sort out those different conversations. I mean, you'd have Norfolk approach rattling. That had to be your primary, because you had airliners full of people coming out. You had to answer Norfolk, or they wouldn't work with you anymore. But then you'd have an FM and another aircraft channel going that we separate ourselves on. So you'd end up with 6 frequencies fed in that headset. It would drive you nuts. Then for a while, one of the worst things we ever did, we came out with a thing called a scrambler. And it drove everybody nuts. I mean, these FMs were so good, you never had to identify yourself. I could say, Captain Smooth, drop off port side. Well, he knew from my voice that it was Satchmo and not Julie Andrews, but when we got the daggone scrambler, the idea was to keep competition from listening in and see what you got. The conversations went like this: Captain Smooth, drop off port side. And he'd come back, he'd say, man, I didn't get a word of that. It sounded like you said something about the cheerleaders, but I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who you were or what you said. And it was awful. I mean, it drove us crazy for a couple of years trying to do that.
Well, when we started, we're using marine radios, weighed about 100, had to have 2 of them, weighed 100 pounds in your back seat.
Wow.
With the speaker in the side. With the low frequency radio, you had to drag an antenna behind you 50 feet, let it back like a trolling hook, and we could talk across the country, about in California.
Wow.
So,
Would you have to crank that in to land?
If it didn't be a lot of rattling back there, you had to crank it in before you landed, yeah. But when I quit, there was 62 boats out here in the Chesapeake Bay. And 32 airplanes.
Holy smokes, no wonder y'all were running together.
So we had a 100-foot separation.
100
A lot of them, 12 of them didn't separate. We get to the funerals.
Yes. 100 foot, I can't imagine.
Yeah.
We always operated, when I came along in '80, you know, we always did 500 foot, and that wasn't enough for some people, you know. And everybody gets off in the heat of the battle. Everybody gets off a little bit. You know, the big thing was 500 feet, you know, the chances were you weren't going to get off.
That's close, yeah.
Both of you get off at the same time.
Yeah.
But it's big improvement now. These guys are doing a good job. And the recruitment's different now. Now that the safety record's better, we're getting people off the boats. They're coming from the culture. Big thing for me was just learning the terminology. I mean, somebody'd say, hold a little boat. I said, man, what are you talking about? They look like the same size to me, you know. So it's a whole lot easier to train somebody that's coming from the culture, that knows the language and you know, the techniques involved. Where the first generation guys, they were bringing in pilots and having to teach them. I heard a story about, Lynn Lowry told me this. I'm not going to say who it was. Try not to anyway. But anyway, this man was a very successful fish spotter, ended up becoming a chief and all that, was in the industry for years, up here on and in the Gulf. But Lynn would say, first day I hired him, he flew around for 8 hours and never could find a boat. He said, I finally told him, if you could find the airport, take that thing back and tie it down.
I was just wondering, since we do have a lot of spotter pilots in the audience, if they wouldn't mind standing up so we can acknowledge them, because I see them fly over our museum every day, and it's to put a face to some of the pilots. I would appreciate it.
Thank you again so much for coming out tonight for our lecture series, and we hope to see you again April the 4th. Thank you.